Hi everybody, this is Anne. Usually when we talk about constructing our pottery, it involves techniques such as slab template techniques or coil techniques, processes where clay is added to itself in regimented fashions to achieve the desired form. In this video, I'll demonstrate a reduction hand-building construction technique where we create a solid finished form and then scoop away the clay to hollow out that form. I'll complete one project, then show you several alternatives to spark your imaginations. Let's get started making a teardrop vase. Since this technique starts with a rough final form, I'll show you my tips for achieving that. I started out with about 2 pounds of clay. The amount will depend on the size of your particular design, of course. The clay has to be the same consistency and not too soggy or too hard, so step 1 is to wedge it really well. After wedging, I rolled the clay into a nice tight cylinder. As the edges are uneven, I tapped one of the circular edges to obtain a flat foot. I used my thumb to compress and smooth the clay on the bottom. Next, I started to work the clay at the top upward by first compressing the clay towards the top with my fingers, and then rolling the cylinder, putting pressure at the top part so it narrows down like a carrot. I placed the cylinder flat on the table and worked the clay even higher, squeezing it between my fingers while turning it around. To smooth some of the bulges out from the body, I rolled it just a little bit more. I wanted just a little inward curve at the bottom of the vase, so I tilted the form towards the foot and gave it a slight roll. Each revolution, I'd flatten the form out just a little for a gentle curve. You can see that the rolling pushed the clay downward, creating a divot at the foot. To remedy that, I pushed the clay at the sides into the divot to even it out. Then I flattened the foot once again, finally wetting my thumb and compressing that clay a final time. I still need to create an opening for my vase. I used a pencil to map out the front and back of the vase and how I'll cut it. I wanted a taller front and shorter in the back. I then used my wire tool to slice an even piece out. I wanted to create a wider opening at the back, so I turned that slice of clay upside down and attached it really well there at the back side. I sculpted it with my fingers so the lines flowed well from the lip to the body. The front lip of my vase looked a bit thin, like it needed a little extra support, so I added a couple of balls of clay to each side to brace it. Finally, I gave the front lip just a slight curl and smoothed and compressed that outer shell of my piece one more time. Now I need to cut open the form and hollow it out. I don't want to cut straight down through the foot if I don't have to, as the stress during drying will make that vulnerable to cracking. Instead, using my wire, I cut the bottom section right off of the form. I set the bottom section aside, and then I sliced the top body vertically in half. Using a pencil, I traced a 1/4 inch around the shell of my form, mapping out a sort of selvage edge border on that cut bottom. I also traced a 1/4 inch around each of the half parts on the inner flat side and also on the flat bottom side. I traced around the top rim. A friend of mine, Nancy Gordon, gave me this loop tool. It's my favorite to start scooping out the clay. I can make aggressive, deep cuts to get the majority of the clay out. At the same time, it's not too wide so that I worry about taking too much clay away. I started in the center, and as I got closer to my boundaries, I switched over to a smaller loop tool to shave away smaller bits and refine the inner wall. When I had the majority of the clay removed, I began smoothing the inner surface with my damp thumb. I made sure I really compressed the bottom floor of the piece and made sure there was no air pockets. I repeated this process of scooping out the clay with the first side wall. Remember that as you dig deeper and closer to the exterior wall, it's a blind move. It's important to work a little slower and place your hand against the outer wall to feel how much give there is in the clay. Now, shaving clay is also possible with this carver. If you hold the loop flatter to the surface, it'll just skim away thin layers. To get that bottom section, I like to gently cradle the clay in my hand so as not to distort the shape, and then just whittle it out. Like the bottom section, I wet my thumb and smoothed and compressed the clay wall very delicately. When I finished that, I placed it back against the solid half to make sure I didn't distort the shape. I repeated this process with the other side so that now I have all 3 sections hollowed out. Before reconnecting them, I placed them together just to make sure everything would fit together like a puzzle. That looks good. Now it's just a matter of scoring all the flat sides, then brushing slip around the bottom section and one of the half sides. I positioned everything in place and began using my fingers to work the seams back together. To add a little more stability along the vertical cut as I worked the seam together, notice that I inserted a long paintbrush along that inner wall. Seams are always the most vulnerable areas to cracking as the clay dries, so to reinforce those areas, I rolled some thin coils and worked them into the seams. I couldn't get into the inside of the piece, so I just worked it along the outer edge, then ribbed it with my rubber rib to compress and smooth it. I smoothed it horizontally and vertically into the outer layer of clay. I made sure to work small balls of clay at the seams, especially at the rim. That'll be the great place for the clay to split as it dries. I then used the long damp paintbrush to work the inner seams together and smooth the surface the best that I could. To remove all dents and fingerprints, I ribbed and compressed the clay again with my rubber rib on a banding wheel. I also made final thin cuts to the longer lip of the rim. Now here it is all constructed. I'll place plastic over it and let it dry slowly. Now here are 2 variations that I finished earlier. I hand drew and underglaze painted them when they were bone dry. I bisque fired them to cone 04, then glazed around the illustrations and fired them to cone 5. For those of you who are not comfortable throwing on the wheel, this is a great alternative, and you have more flexibility to create the form that you want. Now that vase was just a jumping off point. There are so many variations of shapes you can make. For instance, here I created 3 teardrop shapes and thought it'd be fun to combine them. I fit the rounded edges together, then began rolling them to add pressure and flatten the inner edges so they fit like a puzzle. I then used my finger along the inner seams to work those together. I rolled coils, then added them along each middle section. I turned the piece upside down and worked more clay between the 3 lobes to create a foot. I used my wire tool to create a diagonal opening for my vase. I gently pounded the vase on the table to make my foot sit flat. When I was pleased with the shape, I repeated the same steps as the first teardrop vase to cut and hollow it. I cut the bottom off, then cut through the center of the body. I mapped out where I would cut so as to leave a 1/4-inch shell, then I began hollowing it out. Like the first project, I scored, slipped, and worked coils into the seam. Now here's one that I created earlier. You can see that I also twisted the neck a little bit to add a little interest to the form. Again, I painted the maple leaves when the piece was bone dry. I glazed and fired it to cone 5. I love the unique tri-lobe shape that it would have been much more difficult to achieve with any other technique. Now I'll give you one more variation. Again, I started out with that same teardrop shape. I flattened the top to give it a rim, then worked the clay smooth, compressing it down. This time, I cut through the exact center of the entire form all the way down, as it's important for the creation of this particular shape. I shifted the 2 sides to offset the top so it'll become 2 openings. I had to work the bottom flat again, of course. It's important to really connect those 2 sides together and homogenize the clay so it won't be tempted to split later at the drying stage. I added extra clay along the seams to reinforce them. I checked the foot of the piece and worked, smoothed, and compressed that area. When the shape was exactly what I wanted, I again cut away the bottom to begin hollowing out the piece. I could have cut through the center again to hollow it out, but I thought I'd try and see if I could avoid it. I started by hollowing out each opening and into the cavity through the top. I mapped out where I needed to scoop and hollowed the piece through the bottom all the way to the top. It took a bit of time as I wanted to go slow, but it was easier to get into the inside and make sure my inner seams were good and sealed. Now here's one I created earlier where I carved a simple line design from one side to the other, creating nice lines to unify the form. I glazed the borders with Amico Tangelo and the body with matte eggshell glaze over the carved lines. That really is unique and looks great with the flowers. We really want to send out a thank you for all your generosity in supporting the Little Street Pottery Research Facility. We had a record number of patrons joining our team, as you can see. Now, if you would like to join the team and earn a cool title, click on the Super Thanks button or the link to buy me a coffee. And don't forget to like and subscribe. See you next time in the studio.